Well, Calvin, thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
Okay, punk, to me, I associate punk with a do-it-yourself ethos of making your own label, making your own band, this and that. So, as a proponent of that philosophy, you are kind of a maker. You create things. You run a record label. It's called K Records.
K.
You also make your own records, or records with your own bands. And I think a lot of people might see you as a kind of a leader of this or an inspiration. And I was wondering who you drew inspiration from initially for K Records, because K Records, I know it started as a cassette label.
Yes. Well, cassettes, the concept of the cassettes was really the idea that we're borrowing from the work of E.F. Schumacher. He wrote a book called Small is Beautiful. And his concept is appropriate technology. He's saying that the latest and greatest technology isn't necessarily the most appropriate technology for achieving the ends which you might have. So I took this concept of appropriate technology into the world of underground music, and I realized that for a lot of the people I knew, they're just making their songs, they're playing at the parties, they're having a good time, and that is its means to an end, the end being having a moment of creation and sharing it with your community. But sometimes they're like, hey, your songs are really good. Can I buy a copy of your album? But they didn't have an album, because in their world, the people who might actually buy the album might be 30 or 50 people. But when you make an album, you have to make 1,000 to even make it worthwhile. Otherwise, if you only make 30 albums, it's going to cost you like, $1,500 or whatever it was. So you might as well, if you spend $1,500, you might as well make 1,000 albums. But then you have 1,000 albums and nobody wants them. So what do? Make furniture out of them? I don't know. That could be nice. But the cassette came along, and it was something where you could just make 30 or 50 cassettes, and it didn't cost $1,000. Cassettes had existed for a long time, but it was only around that time, 1980, 81, that they became viable in terms of their portability and their sound quality. So we created our releases using that technology. And it's strange because somehow along the way, people got the idea that K represented a Luddite philosophy, which to me, K has always represented not a Luddite philosophy, but a philosophy of using the newest technology when appropriate.
Yeah, you were one of the first people that I knew who has embraced internet.
Remember that time I sent you an email?
Yes. I think it was the first one. Except, before that I got an offer for Viagra, and it really changed my life. But anyway, then I got that, hi, hey, and it's gone. No, but yeah, I guess when I first heard about K and I saw the yellow newsletter, it really looked unlike anything else in underground music that I knew of. And it really did seem like a self-contained universe. It had this whole set of aesthetics and bands and, affiliates, and it was very different from, Maximum Rock and Roll or Flip Side or something like that.
Yeah. I think I was inspired by punk rock itself.
Yeah.
And that was going on in the 70s where there were a lot of labels. But the thing about the labels in the 70s, the punk rock labels, is they were mostly labels that just did 45s. I mean, it's just a different dynamic. A band would put out 145 a year, and they were the top band. They were it. Nowadays, you put out a new album every 6 months or something. It's just different. So the mindset is really different. But there's something about that format that's always appealed to me, the 45. And if you read about the history of music, it's mostly based upon the single, the format as the driving format for the development of scenes and genres, and certainly punk rock is based on the 45.
Yeah.
There was interesting 45s coming out.
Yeah.
The Cramps had some singles out, and I was really inspired by that. Half Japanese, Calling All Girls, that's a great 7-inch.
Yeah.
Because it was like, they took like 35 songs and put it on a 7-inch record. And it was just like, whoa.
Yeah.
Calling All Girls.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of 7 inches were like albums.
Yeah.
you know, or they had the same
Well,
kind of dynamic of an album. It was
The vibe was, let's just put our everything into
yeah.
this little piece of plastic. It's only going to have 2 songs, so it better be like really speaking for us.
Yeah.
And so it has so much more potency than like an album.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting. So I think when we work with Kay, a lot of it was trying to present the same thing to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And another big influence was like Folkways Records, which was, the idea there seemed to be documenting things and making them available. It didn't look like they were spending a lot of time marketing the records.
Yeah.
What they were doing was documenting something and then making it available to whoever was interested in finding out about it.
Yeah.
Or appreciating it. And I think that Kay, we took on that a lot too. We would just find people that in our town or Olympia or around, and that seemed worth documenting. And that is actually what happened when I first saw your band performing, Ulysses.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, this should be documented because there's nothing quite like it out there.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
But
then you changed your name to Nation of Ulysses.
Yeah.
And I said, deal's off.
In the 1970s, mass media proposed a new nuclear unit, which was the rock and roll group. Partridge Family, the Hair Bear Bunch, things like that, the Archies. Everybody was supposed to be in a group.
Mm.
Now the mass media is really proposing a new nuclear family unit, the family. There's a lot of propaganda about having children. All the celebrities are boasting about their children. They've got these new movies coming out, Knocked Up.
It's not a new concept. In the late 60s, a lot of rock and roll bands, they felt a lot of pressure to appear mature. And you'll see on the record covers, where in 64 or whatever, they're all wearing matching suits. And then in 65, 66, they move into sort of the mod era, where they're wearing casual clothes, no ties, not necessarily matching. But then when you get into like 68, 69, it's real casual, and all the kids.
Yeah, children.
Kids and the partners and stuff, showing that, well, we're mature artists now. We have reproduced, and that's what it's all about. We're not teeny boppers anymore, was kind of what they were trying to say with their body language and their imagery. So I think that we may be entering a new phase like that. In the early 00s, everyone was just party time. You had your bands, I forget who they were, but they were like, woo!
Yeah.
Let's do it. Wear tight pants. Send us your daughters, that kind of thing. But now it's more like, oh, we've matured, we've grown our hair. We listened to our parents' records and realized there was some value to some of the more esoteric and perhaps pretentious music of their generation. And we are going to show that we are mature adults, and can I borrow your kid for this photo shoot kind of thing?
So maybe the whole thing of having this, like the children in the pictures, is proposing an idea of community. And that seems like something you're really interested in.
Yes.
An international pop underground is something that you proposed.
Yes.
A long time ago. Do you see yourself as the leader of the international pop underground?
No. Because, as I envision it, there is no leader. It is a decentralized, amorphous, amoeba-like entity. I think I draw a lot from the work one of the most radical and forward-thinking artists of the 20th century, Charles Schulz. And in his world that he's created, it is a true underground. There is just a world created, lived in and created by the inhabitants, who are the friends of the main character, Charles Brown. It's self-sustaining. You never see any adults at all. They might refer to them offstage tangentially, but they have no lines. They have no place in this world. So it is a true underground in that sense. It's a world within the mainstream world. And everything that goes on in there, though, is a microcosm of that mainstream world. You can't escape the problems of what we might want to refer to as the real world. I mean, that's why the underground must always reinvent itself to try to deal with these problems. And that's why we've had some good movements that have addressed those issues. Issues of sexism, racism, things like that. Because we all grew up in the world.
If in this analogy of the underground is the Peanuts universe, who is the little red-haired girl? Because she's the one child character who's never seen.
True. Good point. Hadn't thought about that.
You perform a lot. You go on tour a lot. You ramble a lot across the country. And I'm wondering, like, are you always working on your performance, and what are you aiming for, and like, what's your kind of trajectory in terms of performance and like trying to get better?
Well, that's a good question. I have no idea.
I guess what I mean is, I've seen your shows evolve a lot, and there's a real theater aspect to it. It seems like you're not just executing songs, you're very aware of creating an experience that people will be, you know.
In the early double O's, I think I was more into pushing out of the boundaries of just a person playing songs. And with Double Narcotic Sound System, a lot of times we were trying to create an atmosphere where people felt comfortable just responding to the music in whatever physical way they felt was appropriate. And a lot of that has to do with the late 80s and early 90s, where people just, for some reason, just stopped dancing. And it didn't make sense, because rock and roll is supposed to be about, you know, dancing. When you read about the history of rock and roll, one of the biggest criticisms was that the inappropriate movements being made by the performers and the audience members to the primitive and jungle rhythms. And I felt like, well, let's carry on with that tradition. What's happened? We've stopped. We're all just sitting there contemplating the profundity of this music, and it seems really like pointless. And it really comes down to, where's the passion? Listen to some of this music and it's just like so passionless, so dead. It may be like profound, but its profundity is lost on me because I already fell asleep. So with Double Narcotic Sound System, we're just like trying to get as basic as possible with people's primitive emotions. And then I had this idea, make up some songs and just play them all by myself without a band. And a lot of times people think of that as a template. I think a very dangerous template for that is what they call the unplugged syndrome. You have some fantastic, amazing rock and roll band, like Poison or Guns N' Roses or something. And they get on a show where they're doing the same songs, but it just so happens that they're not using amplification. And for some reason, it means two things. It means, first of all, it has to be boring. And second of all, it brings out the profound nature of their work. But there is no profound nature to their work. And what makes them amazing is the primitive psychology involved in their beats, their performance, their lyrics.
Yeah.
So when they're sitting on a stool playing acoustic guitar, it's like they just ruined it.
Yeah.
It's dead. They might as well be on some Chicago label or something, you know? So when I play, even if it's acoustic, I feel like it's still rock and roll. I mean, if you look at the early rock and roll bands, they were playing acoustic instruments.
Yeah, doo-wop, a lot of it was on the street corner.
Yeah, or even the country bands, they didn't have amplification. And the rockabilly bands, they were totally rocking. And it had nothing to do with electricity.
Yeah.
It had to do with what was inside their soul. So it really annoys me when I show up with my guitar and people they have like a chair. Okay, here's where you sit. Like, I don't have time to sit. That's not punk rock. But I've learned over the last year, it just dawned on me recently, I haven't really been paying attention, that a lot of people who are doing music in the underground world they're so far removed from punk rock. They don't associate themselves. They don't identify with punk rock in any way.
Do you think a new term has to be presented?
Well, there's always new marketing terms.
I guess what I mean is maybe the problem with punk is that it's come to mean so many things. It's like Christianity, so people don't feel like they want to invest in, or do you know what I mean? Like,
That could be true. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of it that way.
because it's definitely
You mean that it has no meaning.
exactly.
But it obviously has some meaning because they actually take pains to point out that they are not that.
That's true.
They're like, oh, I'm not punk. What?
Yeah.
Which is fine because, I think that's the decentralized nature of the underground. See, if everyone was punk, then it would not be decentralized. It would be a column with a hierarchy. And I think the best thing about creative work is that there is no hierarchy. There's no best album of 2008. There's just albums that we've enjoyed.
You've been credited with inventing this one look with a wool sweater, torn jeans.
It kind of was my uniform in the 80s. It's true.
But then you moved out of that.
Yeah, it's true.
What-
it was like, well, see, the thing
what
that the
prompted the change?
the Levi's, torn Levi's, straight leg Levi's, that was all inspired, by punk rock again,
Yeah.
Ramones and those bands and stuff.
Yeah.
And then the wool sweater, just like finding old wool sweaters at thrift stores and stuff. I think the first big score, well, I went to the Salvation Army in 1980 and I found like the perfect sweater.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't wool, it was acrylic.
Yeah.
And I was kind of like into like the whole natural fiber thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, yeah, I like this sweater, I like the way it looks, but it didn't feel right. So I went to the Goodwill As Is in Portland, and they were selling their clothes by the pound, 23 cents a pound. Just fill up a bag, clothes. I got like 40 sweaters. That was kind of my look for the next 10 years or so.
But you mentioned being inspired by punk, and I know that you went and met Patti Smith at the airport when she was on tour, and people don't really do that anymore. I don't know. Tell me what the...
Well, the weird thing about that
Yeah.
is that this is 1978. She was playing in Seattle, and everybody from Olympia at the radio station, KAOS, where I hadn't actually started working there. I was just being trained at that point to do a radio show. I was 15. And Patti Smith was playing, and so everybody at the station went. First, they went to meet her at the airport. Then she went to the Peaches Records to do a signing, and then she played at the Paramount Theater. And I just found out recently that the day before she played Seattle, she played Portland, Oregon. And she flew from Portland to Seattle. Now that seems very strange. Very strange.
If you got him, smoke him.
Yeah, it's true. So in my mind, at the time, she was like flying in from New York.
Yeah, yeah.
Straight from CBGB's.
Yeah. That's what's interesting to me is all those punk people, and they were on the big labels, and they were flying
I
from
know.
Portland to
That's-
Seattle.
See, that's the thing that...
And yet you
Seeing at
started
the
K
time-
Records, the cassette label.
At the time, it seemed very... I couldn't put it together in my mind. Like, punk was happening, it was do-it-yourself, it was like creating your own media.
Yeah.
The whole idea of doing your own fanzines, doing radio shows, put on your own shows, put out your own records, put out records by your friends. It was all like, we are going to subvert mainstream media by creating our own media. Yet, all the bands that everyone referenced all the time were on major labels. Ramones, Patti Smith,
The Clash.
The Clash, Dead Boys. These are all major label bands. So there was something that was like, it wasn't quite making sense to me. But, then all the bands that were really cool, the Avengers, Slicky Boys, they were on independent labels.
Yeah.
And working at Chaos, they had a music policy there that was like, play at least 80% independent label music. And I took that to heart. I really did. It was more than just on my show. It was in my life. So I really sort of gave up on major label artists from that point on. And it was a time when it wasn't hard to do, because usually what happened is if a band put out a record or two on an independent label and they were really good, and then they went to major label,
Kiss of Death.
they've just made terrible records.
Yeah.
They were bad.
Yeah.
And it has to do with all the artistic compromises that usually were required by the label, and it's sad. But it took a long time for people to be able to actually make good records, to make that transition.
Yeah.
And
Maybe it was just their perception of like,
then,
now we're making it for the big
well, now we're doing it
audience.
for real.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that is best exemplified in the film Decline of Western Civilization Part 2. It's called The Metal Years.
Yeah.
And you have all these metal bands who are on the scene, playing the clubs, and they're always talking about, well, when we make it, this is going to happen. When we make it, we're going to do this. When we make it, blah, blah, blah. In their mind, what they're doing at that time, playing clubs, that isn't really what they're doing. That's just what they're doing until they can do what they really want to do, which is become famous. At one point, Penelope asks them, well, what if you don't make it? And the guy's like, oh, we're going to make it. And that was really sad. It was just a really sad part because she's like, yeah, but what if you don't?
Yeah.
And that idea had never occurred to him because he was going to, at some point, make it, and then his life will begin.
Yeah.
And it will be rosy. So you contrast that with Decline of Western Civilization, the first movie, which is just a bunch of loser punk bands who are never going to make it. They're just doing what they do.
That's true. X is very like proud
just-
of themselves.
They were just
that
like,
they
we
sold out the club.
do our thing.
Yeah.
And we're enjoying life. We're creating, we're expressing ourselves. And like Chuck Dukowski sitting there with a 40, just like, yeah, whatever, man. We just played a show last night. Cop showed up. Whatever. Move on. We keep going.
Let me think. Wait, hold on. I have some questions written
Check
down.
your notes.
Yeah. Sorry. Not a professional yet. Oh, yeah. I did want to ask you about. Okay, so there's this big craze in the double O's for dance.
Hey, which is not over yet. We still got a couple of years left.
But for dance music, dance 12 inches. Wait, I'm going to wait.
Yeah, I'm listening.
For dance, this kind of dance punk but you were doing that with Dumb Narcotic Sound System a long time ago. Remixes, the dub plate idea, 12 inches.
That's true. But that wasn't an idea I came up with.
Yeah,
It was an idea I was borrowing.
that's true. You really owe somebody.
Well, and I don't think that it was an idea that was owned by anyone. I think there's a cultural arrogance a lot of times in a middle-class white rock culture, subculture, that says like, if you're doing anything that could be perceived in the mind of this subculture,
Original.
having originated in a black subculture, then you're stealing it. That you are culturally some sort of vulture.
Yeah.
But it kind of goes back to the same arrogance that is like, we have no culture. We are the neutral, as if we are the completely neutral.
Normal baseline.
Yeah. But it's like, we have a culture.
Yeah.
We have the culture of white middle-class America. And we are influenced by other cultures, but they are also influenced by us. It's a give and take. Before Elvis Presley came along, there were white artists covering black artists and black artists covering, and there was an interplay between the cultures that's gone on for centuries.
Yeah.
So what happened, I think, with punk rock, when I first started listening to it in the 70s, punk rock made a lot of references to black cultural icons, particularly James Brown and R&B artists from the soul era and from the 50s. Also a lot of reggae references. And somehow in the transition that punk rock made in the early 80s into what is normally referred to as hardcore, that was all lost. And it became a monotheism. It's like you lost touch with these roots.
Yeah.
And I felt like that's one thing that punk rock had restored to underground culture, was an appreciation of the give and take between the black and white subcultures. Because in the 70s, when you had just these bad rock bands just blaring away in huge stadiums, like Led Zeppelin and all these terrible, 70s stars, and they didn't seem to have anything to do with black culture, to me. Being like 12 or 13, I didn't understand the blues element of Led Zeppelin or anything like that. It just seemed like some white guys.
Yeah.
And so punk rock seemed to be bringing that back. Like, let's get back in touch. You know, in the Clash, having, you know, Bo Diddley open for them and things like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay. Hip hop started, and it seemed like, oh, hip hop is like punk rock. It's like the same thing. It's just manifesting itself in a different way. And so I was really interested in that. I was really interested in the dance hall movement that was happening with was sort of what they call the whole new generation of DJs like Yellow Man and Ika Mouse and stuff like that, Sister Nancy. So that all those things were influencing me, and I was really interested in those. And I felt like Dub Narcotic Sound System was a way to explore those elements of contemporary culture that I felt like I hadn't had a chance to look at with like Beat Happening and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And it wasn't always about the music. It was more about the process of creating music or of releasing it.
Yeah. That's one question I had for you is every record that's made, there's piles of records, there's lots of records that have been made through history. But each record, the process of making a record is incredibly painstaking. Why don't people just sing to one another?
Well, one could argue that that's what the internet is. People now are sidestepping that whole process of production, and they are going as almost directly singing to each other. They don't need a record store or a pressing plant. They can just do their song on their laptop or ukulele, and then it's available instantly, all around the world. So we have created, it's really the most basic form of the punk rock revolution. It's a very exciting time. The reason I say it's an exciting time, not that this won't continue into the future, but it is an exciting time because we still have the mindset.
Yeah,
There's still
we
people
haven't
who have
forgotten.
Yeah, we still have the mindset of the production process. I mean, kids that are now like 13 or 14 or 15, they don't know what you're talking about. Although, interesting enough, they're the ones who are starting to discover vinyl and realize that as a format, it has certain advantages over the digital download.
Yeah.
It's just a format. You know, it's not like one's better than the other. Vinyl isn't better than CDs. They're just different formats, and they have different attributes. And I think a lot of younger people are finding that vinyl is an exciting format to explore.
Hurricane Katrina, a lot of records got wet, and now they survived, but the labels have eroded. Isn't that interesting? All these
Still
records without any, you actually have to listen to them.
It's not unlike, well, you just got to get a Sharpie. Start making notes.
You might not, no one might know, some of these records are really obscure and maybe
But does it
nobody
matter?
knows. Exactly, that's what I'm saying. It's kind of beautiful. That's cool. Well, thanks a lot for...
They're very tenacious.
It's really been great to talk to you.
Appreciate you having me on your show. Thank you very much, and yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot.